All right, everybody. We're really excited to get into our first session of Journalism for Liberation and Combat. When Brooke and I were brainstorming this project, the first person we thought of was really the person who introduced both of us to this framework of emancipatory journalism, which is a foundational concept for this whole series. And that was Dr. Jared Ball. And we put together some initial ideas. We met with Jared a couple of times. And even from the first conversation, he was really encouraging and excited about the project and willing to be involved. Now, hopefully, for our audience, Dr. Ball needs no introduction, but I will do the honors anyways. Jared A. Ball is a professor of communications and Africana studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, and the author of The Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, as well as iMiXWHATiLiKE, a mixtape manifesto. Ball is also the co-host of the podcast iMiXWHATiLiKE, co-founder of Black Power Media, and his decades of journalism, writing, media, and political work can be found at iMiXWHATiLiKE.org. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this session, Jared. And without further ado, I will hand the mic and the controls over to you for your presentation.
Right on. Thank you very much. And as I have come to jokingly say, I am honored to be in a league, not only with the folks convening this, but Jared Ware in particular, because I think that we are on a mission to reclaim the value of our name after years of recent abuse that it has suffered at the hands of ignoble holders of it. So, but no, in general, it's an honor to be invited to participate. And as Jared said, I am very excited to support this effort and anything involving the this kind of political struggle and assigning journalism and media making to be part of liberation and combat. So I really appreciate that. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my approach and understanding of emancipatory journalism, which I think is probably flawed and too narrow, but nonetheless, it is how I've been working with it. But as I often like to start when I do talk about emancipatory journalism, I do like to remind myself and others that I only came to learning of it as a result of my own personal political struggle with the University of Maryland, where I was at the time working on a PhD in journalism, where the political combat that was involved in that process led me to being consigned to hide away, or I should probably say exiled to some hideaway, keep him away from faculty and other students as much as possible, office space. And while I was working there, I noticed there was a stack of communication theory journals being slated for the trash, and which I thought was perfect because at the time, the program I was in was itself struggling over the role, the fight between intellectual, academic, social sciences being applied to the study of journalism versus just the practical business approach to performing the art or work of journalism. So when I saw these academic journals being slated for the trash, I thought, how perfect. And I just started thumbing through them, and one of them had as part of the title, I want to say, now I can't even, but I'm not even sure it was in the title at this point, but I noticed that emancipatory journalism was referenced as a phrase in this article by Hemant Shah. And that drew me to the article. And then the approach coming from an anti-colonial or an approach to journalism and media making from within the colonized or from among the colonized really appealed to me. And in it were some of the basics that I've continued to work with that we'll come to in just a moment more specifically. But essentially, they were about being overt and aggressive in applying the work of journalism or media making to anti-colonial liberation struggles. That ideas of objectivity needed to be held up and criticized as themselves often, even the concept itself, often steeped in Eurocentric Western imperial ethic or perspective, and needing to be challenged, and then applying certain principled rules of honest, researched journalism and media making to the very biased and clear anti-colonial political struggle that the work needed to become a part of. Or in other words, that Shaw was arguing that emancipatory journalism needs to be part and intimately linked and part of organized political struggle against colonization. So my own work at the time focused largely on not only wanting to develop just such a philosophical approach to the study of journalism and applying it to Black America, but also to put Black America back into this context of anti-colonial internationalist struggle. So that and the Mixtape radio project I was working with at the time, which at the time was taking in the early 2000s an actual mixtape or compact disc CD mixtape, and you creating hip hop journalism mixes meant to support the organizational work I was involved with at the time. So having that project, my already existing anti-colonial theorization for Black liberation, and then this anti-colonial theory of journalism all seemed to work perfectly. And then itself, iMiXWHATiLiKE, which became the name of the Free Mix Radio Mixtape Radio project, was itself taken from and as an homage to the emancipatory journalistic work of Steve Biko under the pseudonym Frank Talk, where he performed his journalism and wrote columns titled "I Write What I Like." Doing the mixtape, we amended it slightly to be iMiXWHATiLiKE, trying to involve that same political purpose, taking radically political music, the kind of hip hop that was being and is still being kept out of primary distribution outlets, radio at the time, podcasting outlets today, and giving them a new outlet while infusing it with interviews, commentary, journalism, reporting that supported our anti-colonial organizational political work. All right. So that said, I'm just going to show a little bit of just an amended, shortened version of a larger presentation about all of this, and then invite some discussion, some criticism and elaboration from all of you, and those of you who are here participating in this small session now. I really appreciate it. Those who will see this later in a bigger session and have commentary and questions, whether I'm there or not, I look forward to building beyond just this particular event. And again, I appreciate being allowed to participate in this way. So as you see here, again, I'm just starting with the basics of, and at the time it involved, at the time I started doing this in the early 2000s, it involved tapping back into an already existing but suppressed tradition of applying internationalist, anti-imperial and anti-colonial theory to Black America and theorizing Black America as an internally held colony. There are a lot of disputes, disagreements, even between colony versus colonies, whether or not it is a perfect analogy or appropriate. For instance, Amilcar Cabral famously said that Black America was not an internal colony because it was not in one contiguous, Black people are not held in one contiguous geographic or geopolitical encapsulation and are dispersed throughout the country. People like Charles Pinderhughes argue that creates internal colonies. For my purpose, I refer to it all as one colony, whether it's dispersed. It's somewhat in the same way, I think, and actually I didn't think of writing it this way, but and I'm open to discuss this, but similar to the way I think that people would not look at the West Bank and Gaza and then say that Palestinians are internal colonies to Israel. that there are multiple colonizations happening to Palestinians within Israel. They would just say they are colonized, or that Israel is an apartheid state, not necessarily saying they're creating a whole bunch of mini apartheid states or something, something like that, or apartheids. In other words, but for me, the issue is the relationship, as this slide shows here, and whether it's colonies, it's the relationship. So as Jack O'Dell has said, historically, of the Black American condition, or a condition of Africans held in the United States, defining the colonial problem, it is the role of the institutional mechanisms of, when defining the colonial problem, it is the role of the institutional mechanisms of colonial domination which are decisive. Territory is merely the stage upon which these historically developed mechanisms of super exploitation are organized into a system of oppression. So again, whether it's one colony, multiple colonies, it is the establishment of a relationship of super exploitation that is, I think, the most important point. And here, even in 2022, Black populations are still largely geographically isolated. And then even when not, that relationship carries with it, that one of exploitation, being othered as a subhuman colonized subject, the need for a white elite to redefine itself as a colonial ruling elite requires, famously, as others have pointed out, Fanon and Memi among them, the colonized is created as it creates the colonizer. So, and what this does, as I've tried to isolate, is create a specific media relationship to that is attendant to the colonial one. So in this case, I've just isolated some of the I guess we could just say my favorite tenets of that system, so that we understand how media are fashioned and how those in power have historically meant for them to be fashioned here in the United States and abroad. And as they have argued specifically themselves, it is part of an imperial process. There is a colonizing component to media and, in fact, journalism that I think is important to understand, so that when we engage media as radically organized segments of society, we're just very clear what it is that we're engaged in and combating. So as Frantz Fanon has said, colonialism is the total conquest of land and people. So we always have to remember the goal here is the conquering of the land, conquering of the people, reduction of people into consumers and laborers, servants, etc. And that this is always just the simplified goal. And I think particularly in the United States, on the massive amounts of propaganda that we suffer, many of us lose sight of that core fact, are encouraged to lose sight of it. Kwame Nkrumah has said that if you that just again to collapse and make some of to perhaps oversimplify some of these concepts, but to collapse them and make them more easily distributed, capitalism is the practice of domestic colonialism. So for Nkrumah, there was no need to go through the argument of colonies, or do Black people rise to the level of the official definition, and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter, because the simple fact that capitalism is being practiced, that is domestic colonization. I always like to remind that Karl Marx, I think among the many things that he has contributed of great value, is just simply that commodity formation is the original sin of capitalism, and that capitalism wants to reduce anything into commodity form, not only, as I would argue, for the purpose of the simple fact of creating a commodity that can be bought, sold, or traded, but and as something that I'm probably oversimplifying in Marx as well, is that I think he understood, is that it is the formation of commodity is merely the process or the mechanism needed to get to the broader, more important, immaterial ideological component of all of this. That is the establishment of that colonial relationship, that if anything that a group produces or can produce can be reduced to commodity and then therefore controlled in its means of production, then the colonial process can be attached, the imperial process can be attached to everything and anything. So whether it's a blade of grass or air, or intellectual property, or simply ideas, everything must be commodified and therefore reduced and put onto and amended in its form to the process of imperial or colonial rule, or capitalism practiced at home, domestic colonialism. The recently passed late great Greg Tate always used to remind that in the United States, Black or African people had become the original commodity fetish. So if commodity formation is the original sin of capitalism, that original commodity fetish here in the United States is African people. So whether it was the physical labor and bodies, or it's the immaterial production of cultural expression, or the other immaterial production of the colonized antonym to the colonizer. All of that is essential. So, and I think it's important to be reminded of that this is why, or this is in part why we see so many of the repeating cycles of how Black people and Blackness are treated. John Downing and Charles Husband pointed out that in terms of media studies, it's important that we understand that there's the conceptual original sin of this media environment is the need to, again, create the colonizer as you create the colonized. We don't judge each other by who we are as much by who we are not. So white can't just say it's better than Black. It must demonstrate the inferiority of Black. Men can't just simply say we're better than women. We have to demonstrate the inferiority of women, and so on and so on and so on. And then as Marimba Ani has continued to say, that there's a need in the United States in particular, but throughout the Pan-African world, of course, to destroy African consciousness among African people as a political necessity. So this is the general, as I would just summarize it, approach of all media, especially, and this is always the biggest problem that I think we have, is especially media that we like. All of it, and it's particularly its commercial form, but I would argue probably all of it in general at this point, consciously or not, intentional or not, fits in some way or another to this pattern, and therefore needs to be looked at even more critically if we in fact like it. And then just again, as a quick reminder that this media function is also about, from the perspective of those in power, about cognitive warfare, or intellectual warfare, full spectrum dominance, that is conquering the digital world, the journalistic world, the media world, as any conqueror would want to conquer land and people. Psychological warfare, propaganda, advertising, entertainment, strategic communication, mass communication, branding, marketing, what's the other one? What's another one I'm missing? But anyway, all of these, I would argue, are euphemisms for one another, synonyms and euphemisms for one another, and all meant to mask what is the ultimate goal of the media system in this society, the journalism system in this society, and in all Western societies, is counterinsurgency. That is to, as they have stated in their own literature, I'm thinking particularly of Yasha Levine's work, Surveillance Valley, where he unearths the documents where it was said specifically, going back to the 1950s, that as a new computer, technological, digital media environment was emerging, it must perform a counterinsurgency role, specifically when addressing itself even to Black America. That Black people have always been seen as a counterinsurgency threat in the United States. And I always am reminded again that if we even go back and read Herbert Aptheker's work on Negro slave revolts, I think that whole series rather of his Negro history, whatever it was called, that when he talks about Nat Turner, he shows the primary source journalism news reports of Nat Turner were referring to Nat Turner and his comrades as insurgents. So the same language that was used to refer to Iraqis in their own homeland when the United States invaded, to what is referred to in indigenous people when the United States invaded, is used in reference to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, and so on, is used against Black people here in the United States, again, seen as the same counterinsurgency threat. So again, how this works, this model was adapted for my argument about music and hip hop, but if we notice that up here, one of the components as being noted as playing a negative or is an area of contestation is journalism, the practice of journalism and journalism education. And education writ large, which is just to create narrow frames of acceptable news and discourse. So I won't belabor the point here, but the point is to impact the internally held domestic colony, that is, in this case, Black America or any internally held colonized group. It is meant to impact that group with forms of journalism, media, and education that preset conditions by narrowing frames, acceptable frames of reference, acceptable ranges of thought, narrowing all of that so that, for instance, in moments like these, they can easily plug in anti-Ukraine or anti-Russian pro-Ukraine messaging. They can easily plug in reference to insurgents, invasion, regimes, all of these things. And then the American populace, even many in the Black and brown communities, start to accept these notions of what's happening in the world, having been preset by having a narrowing of our ranges and frames of ranges of thought and frames of reference by an established relationship of media and journalism. So then what is necessary here is I've just summarized in my own work from Hemant Shah and the anti-colonial practice of emancipatory journalism. First of all, even in the name itself, as I note here in A, that it presupposes, that is, emancipatory journalism presupposes that inequality and oppression exist and that there are neo-colonies and colonized populations requiring a form of journalism, a particular form of journalism. So in other words, in journalism and media studies, there are more dominant concepts of journalistic practice or dominant genres of journalistic practice, all of which that presuppose that with whatever flaws exist in society, there is a general freedom of practice and a democratic ethic and a freedom of society that will allow for a freedom of practice of journalism, that will allow for it to be the watchdog of the state, to the watchdog of power, the people's voice, so on and so on and so forth. Always limiting then, ultimately, the forms of journalism, the kinds of stories that are told, the way stories are told by those who need to be telling stories differently to support, again, organized struggle against an already acknowledged setting of colonization. So emancipatory journalism, to me, is just, it doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue or have the proper branding phrase, but it is, to me, such an attractive and accurate approach in if for no other reason, it is the acceptance, the recognition of this pre-existing colonial relationship, which again, I think requires a different kind of response than we are traditionally encouraged to. So that also that emancipatory journalism encourages central to its concept of good journalism are the perspectives of those most oppressed, those of members of communities themselves, as opposed to government or business officials, elites, et cetera. So as anybody notes, when we watch mainstream or even so-called alternative media, those that are deemed the experts set the range of the bias before anything begins. If we are interviewing people who are coming out of political struggle, who are coming out of the communities who are most negatively impacted by society's machinations, if we expand the ranges of thought, we are beginning to perform that key function of emancipatory journalism that ultimately, as part of organized political struggle, is necessary to increase the impact not only of the work, but of the organizations that this work should be coming out of. And then lastly, that the emancipatory journalism argues that notions of objectivity must be critiqued, if not entirely discarded, in favor of clearly identified, studied, researched perspectives that advocate radical reordering of societies. So as I've just reprinted from Hemant Shah here, the prevailing model says that the focus of story should be events, the primary sources should be officials, the writing style should be factual, and legitimacy should be science-based. I'm probably about to contradict that point in just a moment, but the emancipatory model is process. The focus of the story is process. Primary sources are ordinary people. Writing style is interpretive, and the legitimacy comes out of grounded knowledge. Now, I just want to be clear, especially in this moment of COVID, et cetera, and so forth. I think it happens to be important to note some of the differences in the way I think Shaw was defining this and the way I think we need to interpret it. Science, meaning that, again, state-sponsored data, as opposed to grounded knowledge, which should be taken into consideration when it is not allowed into state-sponsored conclusions or data or the formulas that would conclude in certain ways. If they're not able to account for grounded knowledge and experience, they're going to obviously conclude in certain ways or reach certain conclusions. But I just want to be clear that I am pro-science, both in terms of science as it relates to the science of revolutionary study, that is, whether it's radical social science or dialectics as the science of life, or whatever we want to call it, or the science of revolution. I think that is, I don't want to just encourage that we discard that, but I do want to encourage that we be willing to critique how science is conducted, or the bias or the politics of science, and then also infuse and center the experiences of those most negatively affected, and the struggles that those communities experience, and then the response and the analysis that comes out of that struggle. So anyway, I hope that makes, we can come back to that. But anyway, now this is an imperfect summary, but I do like, and I think for our purposes and keeping it relatively brief here, that how we got here, or the media environment, the structure of the media environment as it exists today, is, I think, something that is important, and something that has, I think, my generation, I think, certainly missed it, didn't understand it, didn't appreciate it, got a lot of it wrong. And I think subsequent generations are having to catch up to, and that is the development of the digital media environment and what that means. Now, for those of us of a certain age, we will remember that as the internet and digital media became more popular and pervasive, much of the argument behind it was, this is going to be the playing field leveler. All of us are going to have a voice. The world will be at our fingertips. It's going to bring the world closer together. Everything from, artists are going to have an easier time of getting their work out there, to radicals being more easily heard, whatever. All of this was said to be what was coming. And in fact, the exact opposite is what has happened. And some of us were in that small group of people predicting that this would happen. Whether it's just simply the bias of communication, as Harold Innis called it, that shows that new communications technology brings about increased consolidation and accumulation of power. or whether it was a recognition that the internet itself was military technology, and has always been seen as that and been put to the purpose of the counterinsurgency project, or whether we just understood that new technology, absent political power and control over it, cannot be used to change the existing social relationships. In fact, it will just enhance them. So, but this one paragraph, I think, says a lot about how we got there. And in this presentation from Nancy Cott, I'm summarizing here, she says that she describes that a plague, and what she describes as a plague of news sources and modes of circulation, that Nancy Cott has appropriately summarized the evolution of our current media environment as being developed largely over the last roughly 25 years and in two phases. Phase one, the initial 1990s commercial capture of our national cable networks by Fox, NBC, CNBC, and Bloomberg. And then the second phase of the new millennium internet and social media rise of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Most relevant here is what Cott concludes we are left with is a kind of personalized, tailored view of the world provided for each of us in ways we have been constructed to accept. So in the first phase, there was the again, you know, that initial primitive accumulation of all of all the media wealth. And while they're described here as Fox, MSNBC, CNBC, and Bloomberg, these are really the branded faces of private equity or the consolidated wealth of a handful of extremely wealthy people who are purchasing these entities to be the psychological warfare arms of the military industrial complex, of the state itself, of major elite corporations, all of whom are basically in an incestuous relationship with one another. And then in the second phase, an increased level of consolidation, or a new level of consolidation grafted onto the previous phase. We see the same thing happening where Alphabet and its subsidiary Google, Facebook, Twitter are now themselves the playthings of the State Department, of the most elite advertisers and corporations, and who are policing the use of these platforms to make sure that only a unidirectional form of colonizing propaganda can take place unfettered. So whenever anyone else tries to use it, even if it's for other propagandist purposes, if they don't comport with those who have already set this up, then they are deemed as a threat and a problem, or of abrogating some rule, and therefore deplatformed. In other words, these social media were designed for a specific propaganda purpose and cannot be used for anything else. So for all the good we might see ourselves doing collectively with media, with these social digital media spaces, we have to understand that it in no way approaches an equivalent form or an equal and opposite force to those who have already established themselves in power. So then lastly, I'll wrap by just saying a few words here, because George Jackson and Blood in My Eye, as extremely important to me personally, I think has done so much in this work to outline, even 50 years ahead of time, what the problem is and how our approach should be fashioned. So that is when he summarizes, for instance, that we need an alternative or underground press that will help popularize and develop a revolutionary culture in response to a fascism that is already here. Recognizing that, as I was just saying, these major corporations that own our media are themselves subsidiaries of a broader imperial process performing that function, and therefore can't be addressed in traditional ways, or can't be expected to change in ways that are traditionally encouraged. For instance, FCC complaints. Some of us might remember media reform movements. The idea of we're going to democratize media when society itself is undemocratic. I mean, George was already laying that out and encouraging that we in his own way engage in the emancipatory journalistic practice of becoming radically politically organized and then producing media and journalism that would support that work and help popularize the idea of revolution as much as possible among as big a segment of our community and audience as we can, thereby making room for the attendant or subsequent or parallel political organization to actually be successful. In our media environment today, we need emancipatory journalism more than ever. That is politically organized production of journalism and media that encourages further and increased engagement and support of that political organization, because we are more disparate and dispersed and limited in our reach today than I would argue ever in terms of media. That is, despite all of the production and the good media that is produced, the relative following of some within our circles who are producing that work, none of it reaches the or comes close to paralleling or balancing or responding to or negating so much of the other well-funded, well-organized, and already shaped to be received or prepared to enter an audience or to be received by an audience itself that has been prepared to receive it than ever. The imbalance couldn't be more clear, I think, today than at any other time, if we take the time to step back and look at it. Actually, many people who don't take that time with a certain political frame to do that, to perform that look, are aware just how bad the situation is, because we do get caught up in our own relative popularity or someone else's popularity and lose sight of just how pervasive the colonizing media and messaging actually is. Anyway, so I'll actually stop there, and for those who are here, invite questions or comments or response, and then hopefully again come back to be able to engage the broader group for more of the same. And again, I greatly appreciate the invitation, and more importantly, this gathering. So thank you, and let me just stop there for.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ball. So just a reminder to folks who are in, the other folks who are in here today, if you once you turn on your video, you'll come into view, and then we can ask questions. So I'll just start off to get us started. I think your work around the mixtape is really interesting for a lot of different reasons, and one of them is a thread that kind of weaves through the presentation that you just gave, which is that one of the benefits that we had growing up with things like the mixtape or, cassette tapes, VCRs as well, right, was like this sort of ability to relatively inexpensively produce content, which still we can do, but also to disseminate it ourselves, right, in a way without having to run it through a sort of corporation or and so like just for folks listening, like to give an idea of where I'm going or what I'm thinking about here, right, like Dr. Ball, your work, our work at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, Black Power Media, et cetera, basically everybody who's going to be a panelist or speak throughout this conference, right, we're using the internet, and not just using the internet, but we're like funneling our sources or our media through companies like Amazon and Apple and Google in order to reach folks. And so like there's a benefit to that, obviously, in terms of reach, but there's also we're competing against their products also on these services, which have much more promotion, algorithms, et cetera, right? And ours are typically sort of targeted to, on an algorithmic level or whatever, right? To not be as prominent. Not only, and that's aside from the fact that we're fighting like an uphill ideological battle, right? That we're trying to change minds away from a sort of dominant understanding of the world. So, I'm interested in that. I mean, I thought one of the interesting pieces within your piece is kind of the last paragraph where, or towards the end, where you talk about basically a debate that you and some other folks were having around the mixtape itself as it was coming to its sort of, I don't know if we can say it's totally dead, right? But it has certainly become something that is like only exists in a kind of digital world or in a very, very small scale, very, very local level. About the internet itself, right? About, well, I guess we got to put them up on the internet, right? Because that's how we can reach people. I'm rambling. My question is really just your question, your thoughts around technology and around like emancipatory journalism. And, I think one of the tensions we'll be discussing throughout this seminar, right, is like, is it something that's best done on a local, not a local level, thinking like to eschew a national project, right? Because I think I like you and this analysis around internal colonialism, et cetera, like I think we do need to be able to reach people broadly, but I also think that we have to connect people locally into those overarching projects, and we have to do so in ways I think that are not just mediated by these large platforms as well. So I'm just curious if how much you've thought about that tension and played with that tension yourself over the years.
I mean, a lot, and but it's also it's been frustrating in that at a very micro level, it is experiencing the colonial process in real time. So in some ways, my work around the mixtape was late to begin with. It was already being pushed out technologically. But that's sort of the point, that whenever spaces are created, because for those who aren't aware, the mixtape was hip hop's first national medium. Before radio, before anything, the mixtape was how hip hop was, particularly on the East Coast, was distributed and became popular and to a certain extent. But as access to a more powerful technology occurred, the communities got more and more disaggregated. So making it harder for the project I was talking about, an emancipatory mixtape project, to function, because the localism got wiped out. People, either through policing overtly or otherwise, were encouraged out of the sort of naturally forming block parties and community distribution networks or spaces, or where a cassette or a CD could be distributed, where you could have something that's not sanctioned by the state distributed with a certain degree of a wide audience. But as people got access to radio, that changes not only the form that can be distributed, but it changes the need. It reduces the need to go to a block party to exchange music or to have music be heard. As radio became popular and hip hop became more popular on radio, I should say, the local DJs lose certain degrees of relevance. Local venues lose certain degrees of relevance. And as everything has moved more and more online, and we've seen from the record stores drying up to certain smaller venues drying up. I mean, it's like the technological gentrification or the technological colonial piece, that as, again, the new technology comes, yes, the promise of wider distribution and dissemination exists, but it also exists in a context of a more consolidated environment. So so there's more great music being created than ever, but it's still harder, I think, to hear it or to have it become popularized, because whether it's radio or whether it's the more nuanced and sophisticated, consolidated nature of the digital media environment, the popularity is on lockdown at levels we've never seen. The ability for Lee or Cohen to influence hip hop and popular music in general, or as a head of YouTube, far surpasses the damage he was doing with Def Jam and throughout the music business back when we were coming up, hating on him for interfering in hip hop and exploiting rap and all this other kind of stuff. So and the same thing with Spotify, iTunes, whatever, all of these spaces are have greater reach, larger audiences, but are more consolidated in ownership, harder to get on, and have even made it harder if we get to the level of earnings for artists to make money. The amount of digital downloads that an artist needs to start to make any real money is astronomical, and I think at best parallels, if not as far outpaces how bad it was when we were talking about how much an artist makes off of physical sales of their music. So so like the space, the political space for my mixtape project, for instance, dried up. Is sort of the point I'm getting at. Like the spaces where it would be disseminated and distributed dried up. The venues were gone. The need seemingly was taken away as people became enamored and attracted to the internet that's going to solve everything. And it's also made it harder. Anyway, the other part of it is that those against whom we are looking to build, and they have been able to take greater hold of the new technology, and the reach of reactionary messaging is far more pervasive and easily carried than is the reach and impact of our work. So I don't know if I fully got into. I don't know if I'm fully getting to the now. I think I feel like I'm just rambling now, but my point is, I think about this all the time. And I think, even with our work at BPM, one of the reasons why we wanted to do that, or I was advocating it from my perspective, is that I think we need to work in collectives to start to create public spheres where Black people and radicals can gather and actually engage, as opposed to even where there are a handful of some who have truly sizable audiences, it feels more disparate and individual, and not creating the space for the kind of exchange that I think we need. And then, of course, specific to emancipatory journalism, we're not doing enough. I'm not doing enough to produce media and journalism as an active member of political organization. So which is really what the philosophy calls for, as I understand. So anyway, I don't know, Brooke, I see your hand is up. I don't,
Yeah, go ahead, Brooke. Thanks.
You're muted.
Committed the Zoom sin, talking with the mute. Like, I don't got the technology down yet. And appropriate enough, because my question is kind of about technology. And I really appreciated your points. I shared them as much, where basically said we were like late to the game. And there was this period where people engaged in kind of this techno utopianism, in the late 90s. I remember that period where like suddenly, like, it wasn't just like the dawn of a new age of media, it was going to be a new economy, and like here in Oakland in the Bay Area, there's like all this money floating around and like venture capital, like all the rules were like slowly thrown out, and like, because it was an emergent moment of technology and media, like there's always this period of like instability where there are different possibilities, and where like the social relationships and those the ownership class and the big institutions haven't figured out like how they relate to the new technology. So there's like a brief window of opportunity, and then it seizes up, it goes away. Because I remember the debate was back in the day, how are we going to monetize this? How are we going to monetize it? Well, they solved that question. They answered that. You know, that's
did,
fully
yeah.
answered, asked and answered, you know? So sensationally, like, I kind of want to talk about right now, like we're in this moment and we're kind of late to the game because we had, I think, our work around media and our consciousness, like it was laid down for like 20 years right there in the middle. I mean, manufacturing consent came out in 88. Stuart Hall's Policing the Crisis came out in 78. The piece that I refer to that's still like really relevant and on point, the double bind of media power, was like in 74, you know, by Stuart Hall. You know,
Yeah,
so basically, and there's this period like during that techno utopianism where it's basically like people threw away manufacturing consent. Like it was suddenly an unpopular book. It was passe, you know, to speak of these things because like it was a new world. But like now we're on the other side of Facebook. Like we're on the other side of the media conglomeration, and every filter, every disciplinary filter that Ed Herman and Chomsky laid out in that book, like all the disciplinary mechanisms by which media is like socially produced, not conspiracy, you know, produced. Basically, like the market forces that discipline and the social forces that discipline media into a certain shape have intensified. You know, they haven't gone away at all in terms of ownership, in terms of advertising, in terms of notions of authority, legitimacy, and sourcing, like who you source in journalism. Flack, their fourth filter, basically the ability for pushback, you know, and basically get hassled if you publish something like unpopular. Oh, and you just got a piece of it too, like talking some shit about Ukraine, and like you got some pushback. So the mechanism for flack is like proliferated, like social media, you know, is right there to give you tons of hell as soon as you step out of line. And then the last like filter was anti-communism or the war on terror. Basically the face of the other as this like evil boogeyman, this like projection of imperial power is the way that elites gain consensus and basically narrow the field of debate. And right now we got Putin equals Hitler, you know, as the external debate. So like when we first started like 7 months ago thinking of this series, like we were just like entering into this like manufacture of a moral panic around like the crime wave. You know, we basically were suffering the after effects of the election, like throwing a switch, you know, and suddenly all the liberals that were just anti-Trump and not anti-fascist actually, like all went home and started sitting on their hands again. And now we're like in like the third simultaneous like sea change, tidal change in terms of like, you know, mass opinion with the Ukraine, you know, situation. So so sensationally, I feel like, and this is just like from my own kind of personal experience, like the simultaneity of both feeling a vast like poverty when it comes to journalism and sources and like opinion making, like, but like an incredible cacophony as well of voices. Like we got 1 million pundits and like 0 or 1 investigators. We have like tons of people parroting like opinions, but no people asking questions. And this goes for it on the left as well. So what's our actual proposition? We actually start making more media to kind of add more to this cacophony? Or like, as we used to say back in the like, you know, punk days, which I came out of, like in the do-it-yourself like ethic, suddenly when printers came out, it's just because you can do it yourself and produce another zine, like, you know, voicing your opinion doesn't mean you should. You know, so maybe our proposition is that a lot of people need to like shift, like shut the fuck up, or like join a political project instead of like, you know, yet another blog where you sit around with your homie and just like talk tons of mess.
It sounds too authoritarian and draconian, but I've thought for a long time that we all like there should be a restriction to like 1 hour. I really was thinking like 1 hour. You get 1 hour a week to post to social media, and that's it per person. That's it. And you say what you got to say in that hour per week, and otherwise we need some room for But just a couple of things. I took notes on that as you were talking, like one, the issue of the monetizing the internet, the problem that they solved, that issue that existed a couple of decades ago. What I think is interesting about that, you're right that they solved it, is that it was, and of course it was solved on the exact same capitalist colonial basis. That is, advertisers have taken over controlling the content of almost all of the commercial media and journalism, music included, that we see. They determine what goes where, and everybody's competing for that roughly $600 billion of annual ad revenue that's being spent. So even just unconsciously, how do I conform? Even on BPM, we have to be aware, how do I say what I want to say so that the Google ad censors don't, wipe us out? It just becomes part of the other side of Facebook, as you said, Brooke. The same thing. They've monetized the move into the metaverse. So those same advertisers are buying up this new space into which we're supposed to become more subsumed in this environment. I even made a note as you were talking about for those who might not, some who might remember growing up of a certain age, I think we weren't alive or old enough to be witnessing them live in their first run, but a lot of us got those educational videos, or we'd even see them in some sort of PSA version of the old Coronet Corporation post Second World War propaganda videos that were designed starting in the 1950s to teach young people just everything that those in power want us to know, like how to become popular in school, how to date, how to whatever. Ultimately, how to not be communists, how to be pro-capitalist, how to be pro-white, how to define America as white, and so on and so forth. All of that was in there as they looked to take old messaging into a new media environment. And today we see the exact same processes, even heightened even more. The manufacture of panic that you talked about, I think we've seen that in the post-COVID moment, the rise of pro-capitalist solutions to what are clearly capitalist inspired problems. That level of propaganda, I think, has seen an uptick. Glenn Ford, the late great Glenn Ford of Black Agenda Report, said decades ago that investigative reporting, particularly as it relates to Black people in the United States, had been wiped out. That consolidation, commercialization had wiped out, to your point, Brooke, about investigative journalism, investigating beyond punditry, wiped that out, and taken those positions out of, starting with Black targeted radio and local communities, and made it to where we are today, where, as you said, there's almost no investigation. Why at BPM we are trying to develop resources to pay to fund people to do that, because we don't see enough of that. And then lastly, again with BPM, that my point about fighting the cacophony is we have to find ways. I know many of us already do this with our individual platforms of cross-pollination and reference, et cetera, but I don't know exactly how to do it. I just want us to think more about how to work together collectively to magnify our work even more than we are currently doing, and creating, again, these public or a public sphere where we're all actually having these discussions, debates, and building with different sets and different frames of reference entirely. So Coco, I see your hand up, and I hope some of that made sense. It's clear.
Yes. Let me just lower my hand real quick. So yes, I'm, for me, I think I'm particularly interested in, these ideas of like nation building. When thinking back to, what you had said of like, we have this internal oppressed colony, this Black colony, these colony of new Africans, right, more specifically. And so, for me, I think a lot of times I'm thinking of how do we create these, how do we create media and spaces that is, more geared toward thinking in those terms, right? And so, a lot of what you had said of like this idea of like even censorship, right? We are at the we are at the I don't know how to put it, but you know, our media is controlled by these corporate entities, right? And so when we're disseminating onto these, you know, social media sites, and, you know, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, or whatnot, a lot of times, you know, we are, you know, potentially going to be censored. But at the same time, you know, thinking of how we bring in people, right? Like there is a lot more access to people through these social media sites because that's what people are used to. So I'm really interested in thinking about how we, you know, transfer people away from those platforms, right? And thinking about creating that infrastructure, somewhat of like what, you know, even George Jackson was talking about at that, you know, that time when he was writing, was like, how do we, you know, build this infrastructure? How do we build, you know, platforms that are not, you know, controlled by, you know, state sanctioned media, you know, and corporate media? And, you know, I struggle with that because I still, you know, engage with these platforms. So in my eyes, I'm like, yes, these platforms are useful, right? Because it has the people are used to it, right? I think that's important. But then how do we, you know, pull together and create our own infrastructure, right? That, you know, limits that type of censorship or that potential censorship, considering how much counterintelligence exists and counterinsurgency exists. So I just, you know, I'm just kind of curious in how you think of, you know, that process of moving away, right, from these platforms, because I think, you know, what's at stake here is that we are creating, you know, and talking, you know, the theory and the dangerousness of that, right? Of, you know, putting that information out there on these platforms, right? And those algorithms and everything, and how they're gathering intelligence against us, right? And so I'm really curious, and, you know, even in my own work, on how do we move away from that, and how do we think of, you know, pulling together to build that type of infrastructure, whether it's our own type of media technology that can, you know, put out that information, right? And again, you know, and thinking of, you know, how do we combat a lot of the, you know, the potential of, you know, counterinsurgency that's happening, especially now that, you know, we see with, you know, anti-Russian and people are being censored, you know, just off of that, and may not even have anything to do with Russia, right? And so, you know, I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, no, I again, I mean, this is very difficult. I think, you know, on some level, I think a lot has to be done from scratch all over again, especially from where I'm largely on the outside at this point, looking at some of the more popular political formations and organizations, and not feeling, you know, inspired by much of what I'm seeing. But at the same time, you know, these are traditional problems. I mean, every major organization and movement we can think of has had its own journalistic or media platform or outlet, and all of them have had to, you know, be concerned about ways that that media could be infiltrated and misused, or people who, you know, who are looking for purposes of surveillance and counterinsurgency to take what's printed or published in that work and use it against the organization. So in that way, you know, we're in very much the same kind of position. So we're also in a COVID moment where, or post whatever, I don't know, where we have to think in terms of getting used to being in person again, getting in front of each other offline, and having the conversations and discussions that we need to have. So I think just in general, the more we do the basics of joining organizations, moving ourselves back into a post-COVID or into a pre-COVID moment of in-person engagement, and then using the very overt and public media and journalism to encourage people into those formations and spaces. And then from there, having those spaces be devoid of technology. That's where, I mean, so beyond that, I really don't know. And maybe we are just in the moment where, as George Jackson was arguing, we just have to do what we can to popularize the idea of revolution, just broadly speaking. But I would like to see what happens when I eventually return to offline in-person spaces that are themselves absent technology. I'm very interested to see what conversations and ideas come up then. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to crystallize a couple of the thoughts that have come up, because I think everybody's touched on similar threads and, some very important questions, which we'll kind of be exploring throughout the series. Jared, you talked about like, Brooke raised the question of the cacophony of voices, right? And you talked about sort of, alliances or coalitions, right? Of folks that we think really do a good job of, at least attempting, and engage. Like, I also think that one of the things that's missing is critical engagement with each other, right, on points of disagreement, right, which I think is actually something you guys do really well over at BPN. But it's hard, right? It's like, it's not something we're so used to, a kind of culture of like, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, or just, I mean, Josh and I joke about this ourselves, but we do a lot of like, absolutely, after whatever somebody has said on our show, like regardless of like whether we agree with what they said or not, right? And like how to even like deprogram ourselves from that process, in a way where we're not trying to be combative with our guests, right? So like we invite you on your show, like we're generally inviting people to share their perspective, knowing it may not fully align with our own, but at the same time, I think that's kind of like a symptom of a larger problem, which is that I think a lot of times folks like debate, like there's so few of all of these podcasts and YouTube shows and things like that that are left leaning, that actually welcome debate, and where you have left-wing folks, radical folks who are willing to lay out their idea and debate it with somebody kind of on a point-by-point basis. I think these are really important things, because I do think there's an increase in sort of, this last week has tested my my optimism on this, but I think there's an increase in sort of left-wing thought, in some ways. But I think that we're not, a lot of times there's a lot of disagreement within this, and there's not like a good way of like having disagreement that's not personal, right? Like it's just like, hey, like you think this, I actually think this, like let's talk it out and see where we kind of land on this, or even just hear people hearing that idea. So anyways, I think bringing back that question you brought of like, how do we create more of a community around these spaces, I think is something that we're really trying to consider with this project. The other piece around investigation has come up a few times, which I think is right on. That's definitely something Brooke and I have talked about a lot in this, is like they're, like we're to the whim of, like in Philly, there's the Inquirer, and they do, 1 or 2 investigations a month, right? Like it's that sort of thing, it's like very limited, the amount of investigative journalism that goes on. And then in smaller markets, it just doesn't exist, right? And then, there's an interesting thing you talked about in terms of like cross-pollination and things like that. One of the ideas that's been in my mind a little bit is sort of like, could we bring back a left-wing news wire of sorts? Like, how could we, how would we recreate some sort of model where like with certain updates or investigative pieces or whatever, it could be shared across platforms? It's something that came about for me in my thinking a little bit with the 2018 prison strike, because there were a couple of pieces I wrote that were interviews with jailhouse lawyers speak, and I had them printed up on multiple outlets. And the thing that I did is I just said, because they would say, well, how much do you want for it? I'd say, I don't want anything. The only thing I want is that you do not own this. You cannot, and I can reprint it anywhere that I want to. Right. And so, and that was fairly successful in terms of getting that in front of way more eyes, I think, than it would have been if it had just been up on 1 or 2 of these sites, because it was like, well, you're going to see it in Abolition Journal, you're going to see it in Shadowproof, you're going to see it in, and obviously like readership of these places might overlap, but there is a lot of variety of that, and I think that those kinds of innovations, moving away from like the personal branding and like the, this is our exclusive, not that it's not cool to have an exclusive every once in a while, but just thinking more broadly about how do we, the infrastructure that we do have some control over, how do we use that in a sort of mutually beneficial way, I think is an interesting question. And then I think on the local level, it's that question of like physical space, right? And bringing people together. And how do you, I think emancipatory journalism, you talking about that mixtape space drying up in terms of like the spaces where it, where it occurred. That was a kind of infrastructure, right? And so like, I don't know the answer of how do we get people back out into those spaces. And I know COVID challenges that even more now, but it reminded me of, I used to work at a place where they did high school dances, and there was a certain point at which the kids just stopped coming, right? Because social media had become, it was more interesting to them to sit at home and do Snapchat on the weekends with each other than it was to actually go out and dance together. And that was like a crazy aha moment, because I couldn't imagine that, but it was true. Like kids just had no interest now in that sort of activity. So anyways, sorry, that's rambling, but
no, I mean, I'm writing stuff down. So first of all, the Newswire piece, I think the real feeling I'm having is a little bit of I don't know, is this jealousy? Like I'm a little bit upset that I haven't come up with this as much as I think about all this stuff. So I think I'm having that, I think I'm just having a moment here of damn it. So like the Associated Press was created in the 19th century by the elite newspapers of the day wanting to share the new telegraph technology without having to compete with one another, but also as a mechanism of setting the national tone for what all these lesser papers would end up talking about. So that's where that agenda setting stuff really starts to, we're not going to tell you what to think, but we are going to tell you what to think about. Could we do a version of that for the real left? Or to what extent does that already exist via just like unofficial, like certain people's Twitter accounts or websites? But I think that I'm just going to be stuck on that. And I'm going to hate that for the rest of my life. I'm going to have to credit another Jared for this idea, but damn. Anyway, I'm going to keep building with that. So, so that's, I don't know, but so that's one thing. The other thing that I made a note of is to respond that Jared, you just brought up, that something that Coco said that reminded me that something that Coco said that I did not, I think, respond to, which is what alternatives to censorship are we developing in terms of platform and space? Because as I would argue, the advance of new technology has increased not only the consolidation of power and the accumulation of wealth, but the ability within that accumulated power to censor, deplatform, etc. So what then would at BPM we're already we've been thinking about this, but just in general, like what avenues then do we have once we've been deplatformed? Because I mean, at best, I think back in the day, the most that could be done is I think through some either legal means or illegal means, the state could block the mail service from delivering a newspaper, for instance. But they could still produce a newspaper and get it to where they needed to get it on their own if they needed to. How would we do that in the digital world today if all of us, or if, for instance, this Newswire that we develop gets deplatformed? Like, what then is the alternative mechanism? And this is where I would be wanting and I'm not going to get into, we don't have, that's a whole other tangent rabbit hole I keep going down lately, but this is where I would think that more of us do need to get involved in understanding and assessing the value of blockchain technology. Not because it's a solution, and certainly I don't think cryptocurrency is a solution, but the one area that I'm moved by where, for instance, people like the blockchain socialist or others make a radical argument, positive argument for its adoption in movement spaces, is that blockchain does offer protection from certain levels of surveillance and censorship that I think we could make good use of in terms of development. I'm not nearly enough adept at this myself, but I think that we should be, within our broader movement, developing and encouraging a greater development of understanding of how blockchain could serve as an alternative, could become maybe the mixtape of digital communication in terms of data protection and anonymity. Not in redistribution, not in some magical, transfer of wealth that's going to make us all, able to fund a revolution tomorrow. None of that nonsense, but just in terms of alternative forms of communication that I think should be explored more from the perspective that we already have developed within those gathered at this event or this program. Yeah, other than that, I don't know. I think I'm just stuck on I'm stuck on this Newswire thing. And then I think, and I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know, other than saying, listen, we're going to make part of our advocacy in our media work, in our organizational work, calls and invitations to get people off of these media spaces and into in-person spaces that are not under the same levels of surveillance. And I don't know, maybe we need to just come up with and say that this is just an overt conscious decision that people have to make as part of of the process of them entering into political struggle. The included in all of that we all have to deal with is this need to break our dependence on these environments. Coco, I saw your hand. I think you were next, or Brooke. I'm not sure who's. I thought I saw Coco's first.
Yeah, Coco, you were up first.
Okay. My video is disabled, so let's see. Let me raise my hand.
Try now.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so I'm kind of like also curious to really think about like terminology, right? Emancipatory journalism, and maybe I wouldn't be like, oh, I'm an emancipatory journalist, right? So, and I think sometimes for me, independent gets a little bit too, is too broad, right? And it may not necessarily provide, the accurate, I guess, and so let me just bring it back. I'm really thinking about how do we identify, right, the types of journalists that are participating in this type of emancipatory journalism, when most of the time people are always titling it independent, when I don't think independent necessarily gives us a very concrete understanding of where this the propagation is coming from. Right. So I'm more curious on maybe, thinking of like in terms of like, how do we identify and, identify the appropriate outlets or the appropriate people who are providing this information when we don't really have a term in particular for that. Am I clear with that question?
I think so. And I think Jared messed me up with this Newswire idea, so I'm stuck there. So for instance, so you're right. First of all, independent is too broad, And emancipatory journalism does have a specific, or particularly the way I've simplified it, has this very specific definition. So one way we could identify the difference is just in that, in the kind of work that is being produced and where the journalist is situated in doing that work. But this newswire idea, I'm wondering, you know, so for instance, I don't know, I need much more time, or maybe one of you can already make it better than this. But so I'm just thinking in terms of where we are now. So if we created, even if out of this event or this gathering, we had the JLC newswire, the Journalism for Liberation and Combat newswire, and we, you know, had a website and a Twitter account, and then we funded it the way our enemies did in the 19th century, by having member organizations like those gathered at this conference contributing a monthly fee that would fund X amount of people we would hire to run the news service, who come out of these spaces, who would supply the news stories to that service, to which we would all subscribe and take stories that would be infused in our media work. To Coco, to your question or your point, I'm thinking in doing that, we could also, maybe as the subtext or as an about section, be explaining that what we are doing is practicing, funding, demonstrating emancipatory journalism. That is, we're not just independent, that is floating around here doing whatever we want. We are we are emanating out of member organizations with a certain, you know, broad anti-imperialist politics, and we are producing media and journalism and wiring media and journalism that is either coming out of those spaces or positively informing those spaces and encouraging membership in those spaces. I don't know, but I feel like I've just collapsed both Coco and Jared's questions and points in a pretty cool way, which probably means I've oversimplified and missed it. But that's what I'm thinking. Anyway, Brooke, go ahead.
Yeah, two birds with one stone, all good, man. Well, a couple things in response. When you were talking about blockchain, essentially what you're talking about is encryption. And like there are any number of technical models out there that like are easily accessible. You know, right, there you go. So like all that is there already, and like and a good number, like out here, a good number of
so wait a minute, Brooke, I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you then saying that the blockchain technology, you're saying it's either already being used this way, or you're saying alternative encrypted methods already exist, making blockchain unnecessary to this project?
Yeah, your second point, like blockchain is employing nothing new when it comes to that level of encryption, you know. And there's like a ton of like either it's IRC channels, like there's old school technology. Like actually the stuff that's more secure is like cruder, older school, like communications, like IRC, because it's not as wide open. Like there's the old internet relay chat, like man, there's ham radio that's like encrypted nowadays. There are mesh networks, there's Tor, you know, distributed like encrypted networks, there's all kinds of stuff. And hell, like news wires used to operate on teletype, you know, like all over telegram wires, you know. Shit, like the Iranian Revolution in 78, 79 was basically, it's like media structure was based on mimeograph sheets or cassette tapes that were smuggled over the border from like exile, like dreaded like religious fascists, like, you know, living in exile in France, but they would basically issue statements and journalism by virtue of like mixtape and mimeograph sheets that were basically reproduced and passed hand to hand. But also, like,
the problem now is nobody has cassette players, nobody has ham radios, so that's why anyway. But I'm sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
But I'm telling you, like, they're like some of these things should be revisited. And like I'm like also thinking the idea like maybe we need to resuscitate the free weekly, like, you know, And a lot of these were viable before they were basically acquired and shut down, you know, like, and frankly here, like I come from this from a mainly local perspective as an organizer, and we don't have a free weekly anymore, like at all. And in terms of media sources for various struggles around here, we have next to nothing. And to Coco's point, we have one that's called independent, like this new class of online platform called like independent nonprofit news. They're even started giving themselves awards like yearly, like the INN awards. And there's one here called Oakland Side, which is horrible. It basically isn't tied to social movements. It basically violates a lot of the principles of emancipatory journalism. In a lot of ways, it basically competes, but on the same paradigm as mainstream journalism, but with kind of a buy local like focus, like what Shaw describes in his paper as communitarian journalism, which is not emancipatory. You know, it's as emancipatory as like buy local is anti-capitalist. Like not at all. It can be just a gentrifier's, you know, newspaper. Like,
right.
It's like buying local doesn't like break any, isn't subversive at all. You know, it basically takes an aspect of the critique and misses the main meat of it. Thank you very much, but no thank you. But the question, I love the basically like a lot of this stuff we'll be getting into more like in every session, but also in the end panel, like the difficulties of actually putting some of this stuff into practice and where to start. So like two things, like there has been a leftist newswire. If you remember the Pacific News Service, it was started during
Vietnam.
What?
I did forget about, you're right. I did,
but,
you're right.
But what happened to it? It was basically shut down in 2017 and it got non-profited. It basically got non-profitized. It turned into a nonprofit and kind of limped along forever. And then basically tried to found this new thing called New American Media, which was essentially kind of basically said it was like about ethnic reporting and making like minority groups like
you know,
basically feel-good stories that were marketed to the leftist press.
I did read so I didn't make the connection when that came out some years ago, right? It's been some years already, but
yeah, and they're all dead. They're all dead now. They're all done. Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay, because I do. Okay,
Service started New American Media.
That's the part I didn't. That was the connection I didn't. So to me, and I'm not. Forgive me. I'm not jumping fully back in. I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, go for it.
It does remind me of some years ago. I was trying to build what I was calling an I think I would know an Africana radical media criticism approach, some kind of. And the point I was getting at, what you remind me is that Rylan Rabaka had this, I thought, a really good point that he made some years ago that I'm going to mess up here a little bit, I'm sure. But the point was the difference that I think you're getting at between Black media and study that more broadly just says, hey, Black people were here and have been here and do great things and look at our wonderful Black people. And then there's another form that gets to what I think I'm interested in and what we're interested in more broadly that says, okay, it's not enough that we're here and we're beautiful and we're wonderful. We need to be organized and militant and radical and have a revolution. And that distinction, even to Coco's point about independent, the distinction with these labels being blurred is being lost. And it's like anything that's positively Black is radical automatically. Anything that's independent is automatically progressive. And, you know, and anyway, so I'm sorry, yeah, but that's
no, that's you're
anyway,
on point. Like the distinction is like, is it running an assimilationist agenda?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like independent is a term of mystification. You know, just because you're like a solo capitalist, owning something instead of a conglomerate, that makes you independent. Like it's a way of like not copying. It's basically a way of performing objectivity in a new way. You know, and there's no such thing. Like you're coming from a position, everything that forms. Every like selection, every quotation, every writing, every bit of editing is basically formed around a point of view. You know, any objectivity is basically just a performance. And the independent stuff is like, it's a way of not copying to the ideology or point of view or basically the subjectivity that's producing like what you're doing. So like New American Media was basically kind of melting pot, kind of like Obama, like era, like post-racialism, you know. So I used to like look at this stuff because it looked halfway interesting, but then again, it's like, oh crap, like, you know, feeling lonely again during the Obama years is like one of the naysayers, catching tons of heat, you know. But kind of like one of the two kind of final points, like that may or may not be questions. I'll commit that sin, like in the panel, like, you know, the question that's not a question, especially by the older white dude, like, I want to, you know, but the 2 points were that one, there's the like, as I progress in years, I'm becoming more and more of a separatist. Like, I don't want anything to do with the fucking dominant culture, you know. But then also, I'm coming out of kind of the anti-authoritarian kind of radical left, like the, you know, anarchist / autonomist like circles. I am also like completely sick of subcultures speaking to themselves. You know, and there's a lot like that in the broader left, like black left, white left, like indigenous. So there's a lot of talking to oneself, just like self-affirmation. Like none of it's really being concerned with reach. And the folks that claim to be speaking to the greater populace are the nonprofits, and they're basically peddling garbage. They're peddling just another version of the assimilation myth. So like there's this tension, like the kind of the impulse to cut ourselves off from this mainstream culture and basically try to form some cultural quilombo. You know, we don't have the Great Dismal Swamp anymore to retreat to, but we're going to try to create it somehow within the shell of the old. But then again, like how do we also kind of create the culture and practice of not retreating into a shell and, you know, basically just talking to each other? I find those to be kind of really in tension with each other, and like no obvious solution, but like nothing to it but to do it, to basically push and try. But I think there's some pitfalls to be avoided, and I'm relying upon this seminar series to kind of illuminate some of them. You know, the second point was that all these big questions we're bringing up, and I just mentioned that Great Visible Swamp, or the lack of territory for a quilombo, or like another maroon colony, or, you know, or for us white defectors, some variant, like, you know, on that, you know, well, within maroon colonies, there were a lot of, you know, white defectors, you know, or on the fringes of it, basically being an interface between like the Visible Swamp and the surrounding country historically. But that these media issues aren't going to be solved by media work alone. That's become very obvious, and something I'll definitely be getting into in session 2, and that is part of a much bigger picture. And I think a lot of it is tied to territory, is the actual neighborhoods and tenure and like longevity and relationships and sitting with each other, being with each other. And that is something that is a really hard nut to crack, you know, especially in the United States, where territory is completely commodified. And basically a lot of economic survival these days hinges on like an eternal diaspora, like a constant churning or mobility, like looking for work. Or you can stay put and basically just starve to death, like you're dying Rust Belt town. Or like me, like I could have, you know, basically worked a dead-end job in construction in Watsonville, you know, and become an alcoholic and fucking just, you know, eat or starve basically on the whims of the real estate industry, you know. So like so it's like simultaneously a little bit of hope, because a lot of these media problems seem very intractable, like they're not part of a greater culture yet. So it's kind of hopeful in the way that, like, as lending aid to some of that struggle, like we realize that much more will help out with that in terms of like tying our fates together in like community building and common cause, like in shared territory even. Or a lot of this will become easier. But then again, like that battle about tenure and the right to stay and not to be put in like permanent exodus from one spot to another, like the only way I've solved that for myself is basically to not have kids, be single, rent a room in Oakland, or else I'd be on the move again. You know, I've been here for 30 years, like on those terms. And if I had kids or anything else, I would have had so many compromises, and I don't know if it'd be possible. I would be replicating my own childhood and be put on the road, basically looking to survive. And like, and maybe our future isn't in the cities to build these communities. That's another question. You know, maybe we need to get out of the contested territory. So that's not a question, but
no, I've just written stuff down, and I don't. So look, I'll just say this, and then I think, I mean, honestly, I think since he passed, I've been thinking about him more. But Glenn Ford was right about many things. But one of the things I think that he was right about, that I've thought a lot about. So, for instance, when we started BPM, one of the things that we keep running into is we want to, obviously everybody who does media and who's on YouTube wants to grow and be as big as whatever. But then, but one of the things that we talk about is, well, how likely is it that we can grow and have a relative, be relatively sizable as other platforms if we maintain a certain politic and a certain viewpoint? We're antithetical to growth in that space, both on the commercial level and then on the ideological level. So what I've always liked about what Glenn Ford used to say about was his approach to Black Agenda Report was, his argument was, we at Black Agenda Report were not looking to become a sizable replacement of some, whatever would be the equivalent today of a major Black or left or even mainstream platform. The goal was always to target specific segments of activists, academics, and journalists who would themselves magnify the ideas and concepts in Black Agenda Report in their spaces. I think that's more or less how we have to operate, that we can't, I don't think, in terms of the media work and even our organizational work, maybe at this point, I don't think we can be thinking of competing with traditional civil rights organizations or sizes of organizations or platforms that are more mainstream or nonprofit or liberal. So I think we need to find ways to produce this work probably outside of our main source of any individual employment, but just with that in mind, that we're trying to target a certain segments of our communities in the hopes that they will magnify the ideas in their space. That way we don't have to worry so much about being, which I agree is a problem, so much talking to ourselves. We should be more talking to ourselves and maybe bringing in certain targeted segments into those discussions without expectations of reaching a quote unquote mass audience in any meaningful way, because I certainly don't think that that's at this point a logical tactic for the work that we're doing at this point. To your point, Brooke, emancipatory journalism by definition, as I understood it and tried to work with it, is designed to be to move us beyond media work. That the work of the media work is only of real value if it's being produced by people in active political organization. That's supposed to be what I think helps protect against falling into that. I'm going to be just an independent journalist. So then I wrote here that we need to newswire ourselves into movement spaces. So create this newswire and make a constant theme of the work being produced and disseminated through that wire, that we be out of into more in-person movement spaces to figure this stuff out. And then it's interesting to hear you share a little bit about your tenure story. I think my tenure story was to choose, was to have a family and choose to get tenure at it was, I wrote here, to choose to get tenure in a marginal space. so it's or to be marginalized within the space, even where tenure nominally protects me. And that actually has been shown to protect me. I've know for a fact there was a target on my employment. Had I not had tenure, it would have been taken. But that said, I just thought it was an interesting choice about what you do have to consider giving up, because there is a political cost to getting tenure in most cases. You either maintain a certain political line, get tenure and at a marginal institution, and then be marginalized within that institution, or you have to choose, as I think, Brooke, you've talked about doing, just to not get it and move around, or be flexible enough so that if you have to move around or even lose tenure, which is increasingly being shown to be weaker than historically, that you have less of an impact on others. So I don't know, but yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. I see
Well, just to
Coco
be
has
clear, I'm talking about tenure is just the right to stay.
Oh, my bad. Okay,
broader
I was thinking
definition.
academically.
Like in
Right,
my
okay,
neighborhood,
gotcha.
not the university.
Right. Sorry.
Like
Sorry.
I'm a high school graduate.
Gotcha.
I'm a million miles from a professorship. But yeah, I'm just talking about my neighborhood, like the right to stay.
Got you. Sorry about that.
Can't
Thanks for the
vote.
clarity on that.
Yeah,
Right
no
on.
worries.
Right on. Right on. Coco, go ahead. Or do we have time? I don't know. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Coco. Yeah.
So real quick, I am kind of curious your thoughts on what, like, the cost of compromise, right? Like, by engaging on these platforms, by engaging in these spaces to, potentially reach, large masses of people. And so obviously these are tools, right? But at the same time, there is some type of compromise that's happening, right? Like I said earlier, there's like, counterintelligence, and, we're just feeding that counterintelligence. So, what are your thoughts on this? The cost of compromise when we're, constantly engaging through these outlets.
Another great question, something I think about all the time. And there's obviously there are certain, there are certain political perspectives that, I and we look to defend. And then there are others that, publicly, and then there are others that we have to encourage be discussed when we're in movement spaces that are somewhat vetted and without this level of surveillance. But there is always a risk. There are the ill-defined immaterial risks of social exclusion, employment, marginalization, as I mentioned. There are, we could go, I'm sure we all have our personal stories. There is a price to pay, as would be the case at any time in history with activist organizational work of a certain kind. So, and this does, in these spaces, we are just aiding those in power in surveilling and managing and even manipulating what we do. So I think we just have to, again, all of these things are better mitigated when we are working in collectives, when we're working in organization, when we are not operating as sort of independent contractors for the revolution, so to speak. It's easier to defend against the abuse and the manipulation or the misuse of the work we do here. But there is always I am constantly vigilant of and aware that there is a cost for even taking what I think are, at times threatening political positions, but certainly not nearly the ones that I most, advocated in my heart. So I said the other day, even the work we do on BPM, I'll speak for myself. It is performative. And I don't mean that in the sense of being disingenuous or conniving or in some sort of, harmful, negative way, but it is a performance. It is a version of me that I am attempting to carefully, by choice, present in these public spaces. So, and I think, we all have to be aware that we're doing that and be doing that, and that there is always a risk. Everybody we've ever admired has been put under surveillance and suffered something. And I think it's unlikely that we would all be able to escape that on some level ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we should probably wrap it up soon. I do want to bring up one kind of final point, going back a little bit to maybe closing on discussion of emancipatory journalism a little bit. Shaw, I thought, brought up a couple of interesting points in the argument, and like Brooke and I had there's a lot that's valuable within that article. And then there's certain things that, pose certain contradictions or concerns. One of them is he advocates for the development of quote unquote professional movement intellectuals, right? And I think that this is one of the things that both Brooke and I, and it's similar, I think to kind of what you're talking about also, Jared, is this sort of tension, right? That might sound like the independent contractor for the revolution. And certainly in an era that we're in now with sort of like, individuals who are basically personally branded, kind of left pundits, I like to call them, right? But, and this is not to throw shade on people individually, because I recognize that in order to fund this type of journalism in this kind of Uber economy that we have now, these are kind of, the processes that people lean into, but it does become an in many cases, kind of an anti-organizational, anti-collective positioning, which I think then, it's problematic. It becomes, again, like you're selling yourself as opposed to, trying to really deliver, great media, great work. I think there's a lot of contradictions that come from it, as well as like the sort of Twitch streamers, right, that call themselves socialists but make $200,000 plus a year, right? Which is, or more than that, right? And the sort of contradictions of that, the sort of, and a lot of their success, I think, in my opinion, has to do with like their ability to kind of embed within like meme culture and like hot take, sort of stuff. And so part of it is about what are essentially intentionally bad takes. I mean, maybe they're not intending them to be, but they're provocative intentionally, right? They're controversial intentionally, which is something that within an organization, right, would be, a non-starter, I think, within at least a revolutionary organization. And so I think that's, that's one thing that throughout this series, I want us to kind of think about and say that we are all, I think, critical of this, of ourselves, and of this idea of basically becoming too professional and too much of a movement intellectual, thinking that we can speak for or on behalf of, some broader left. And I think that's it. One of we got some pushback when we promoted this, right? And that was one of the things, right, was sort of like, well, we don't need more like personally branded, like, we're like, no, we're not saying that. We're not saying that we need 1 million podcasts, right, that are all about one individual's hot takes or something like that, right? It's actually completely antithetical to what we're looking at. And I think that the other point that Shaw makes that's interesting, right, is in the conversation you had with him, and he talked about whether some group was thinking about like sending journalism students that had an emancipatory framework into India to like support the development of emancipatory journalism there. And he said something along the lines of like, it should emerge organically from within a country or a nation, right? It's not something that you want superimposed from outside. So again, I take that back to a similar point of like, we don't want to, as folks trying to engage this work, to have a sort of extractive or colonial relationship to different aspects of the left, right? One of the ways we try to get around that at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism is like, we just ask a lot of questions, right? We let people speak for themselves. And especially when we have organizers or people in a struggle. And at BPM, you all do a great job, I think. I was watching today, and you had, somebody that was dealing with like this wild sort of police brutality, kind of situation that was going on in Atlanta.
It was horrible,
right?
Man.
Yeah, awful. But I think that is, again, one of the things that you all do well. And I guess the final thing I would say is, as a kind of closing of that point, is how do you do that? How do you bring folks in, right? Because, I think one of the fears within the left is like, oh, folks may not have our political line or whatever. So we don't want to necessarily speak to the masses, right? There's a fear in some ways of the people, I think, within certain left media, right? It has to be sort of modulated through a professional movement intellectual, right? Somebody has to have the right analysis. So is it by having people tell their stories and the news and the real, you know, kind of concrete struggles that they're dealing with? Is that the way that you try to approach that?
Yeah, honestly, I'm going to have to go back. I think I need to go back and look again at Shaw's article for what he was saying specifically about the professional pundit.
He does footnote
ahead,
it
yeah.
and say he's thinking about it in the way that Gramsci thought about organic intellectuals, which I agree with that a little bit more. But just the terminology of professional movement intellectual was something that put me off a little bit.
Yeah, you're right. That's yeah. But in terms of this last point, I mean, I don't know that there's any, at this point, there's nothing conscious about, that's not entirely true. So on the one hand, we've had very, very overt and conscious, conversations at BPM about, and we're still trying to figure this out, and I don't think we're all on the same page, frankly, either, is that, where do we draw the line in trying to be broad enough in what we do to get a bigger audience, but then not too broad, to your point, where we're losing sight of the project, the point. I personally, I'm more in that sort of that Glenn Ford lane of, I don't expect our channel to get numbers like other channels. I don't necessarily want that. Because of what I think that compromises means in terms of compromise. So we'll have to see how far, we'll have to see where that line is. I think we're not by far, not at all the first to have to deal with this particular struggle. So, but like what would happen today, for instance, it was perfect because it almost is, it's a natural part of the way that BPM has been set up and who is there setting it up. So, and who's involved. So, and it does lend to the practice, even again unconsciously, of emancipatory journalism. So today, Kalanji is a member of several organizations that do in the streets grassroots work in and around Atlanta on a regular basis. He's now a co-founder of BPM. So just the natural just the natural outcome of that reality of his position in both spaces lends to what we saw today, where he's involved in advocacy for this family around the killing of their, I think, 12-year-old son by police. And he's also in BPM as a media maker and journalist. So his invitation to them to come on and share their story almost performs the natural task or the natural definition performs naturally the definition of emancipatory journalism, as I understand it. And that's sort of what I like about our collective and what we demonstrate and what I would like to see more of, and like I would like to see expanded, including in the reverse, where people like me who have tilted more towards the journalism work get more back into actual grassroots organization and activist work, so that all the work is most magnified and has its greatest impact. Anyway, so that's why I'm saying, like, I think that if understood in this, and even in this simplified way, emancipatory journalism encourages that people who are doing organizational work produce media that supports that work in an organized fashion. I mean, beyond just tweeting selfies at a rally, but and then it encourages people who are tending or trending towards journalism to get back into contributing in those other ways as well. Anyway, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to shut it down, actually, because I think that that encapsulates, I think a lot about, how that looks in practice for folks in ways that they might ask. So thank you for all of your time today.
No, thank you.
Brooke and Coco, thanks a lot for your
Definitely.
questions and participation. Yeah, if folks want to come on camera and say goodbye, then welcome to.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was dope. That was a good interview.
No, right on. I thank you very much. Thank you, Coco, as well.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. Looking forward to connecting more.
Yes, indeed. And big shout out to you all in this whole event. I look forward to watching it and catching up and participating more as well.